great tune to play. Thank you, Nolan. God bless the child. All right, continuing on our International Women's Day program, we have Alice Weinreb from Loyola University, who is a food activist and a Loyola history professor. Welcome aboard, Alice.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Good to have you. One of the things that you're involved with is the Chicago Area Food Studies Working Group.
That's right.
Why don't you tell us what that is and what you guys do?
Yeah, that's an organization that I helped to found, I think, 3 years ago. And the idea is there's a lot of academics working on the history of food, like myself, food culture, and then there's a lot of people who are sort of on-the-ground activists working on working on programs like, city gardens, organic food production, and health activists working on poverty and obesity and issues like that. And so I wanted to find a forum for these people to talk to each other. And that's what we do. So we've organized a series of talks. We had a conference last year, an international conference on global food crises and food shortages, bringing together historians and activists to talk to each other.
And where was that conference? At Loyola?
At UIC. Actually, UIC is the main focus point, and we work with Hull House and other local organizations, a lot of working with women and gender issues.
So does that mean you also have worked with or are conversant with the Food Advisory Council of Chicago?
No, although I know, they sent somebody was affiliated to them who came to a talk that I met. But,
okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Food throughout history is, there are good times and bad times. And one of the things that you've addressed in some of your academic work is famine and war and the toll it takes on people. And I can't help but think of what's going on for people in a number of parts of the world.
That's right.
Certainly in this country we have food shortages for a lot more people than people care to acknowledge, but we know that in Africa, South America, and a lot of places. Can you address the food question and its role in the world right now?
Sure. Well, actually, one of the things that my own work is about is trying to understand the evolution of what I think of as the modern global food economy. And so what I'm interested in is tracing over the course of the 20th century the way that food production and consumption becomes a global issue, and the way the regulation of food production and consumption, that is to say, who produces what food and who eats what food, how that is the shape of that economy is tied to the rise of the global war economy. So I look at the two world wars and the Cold War, and I'm trying to look at the linkages between what are traditionally thought of as military concerns and how those military concerns shape food production, distribution, and consumption around the world. So,
boy, can I tell you that you teach school. Boy, can I tell that. You are full of information in each answer. Let me just ask, right up to today, right now, currently, as we speak, people are starving in Syria because food cannot get to them because men are fighting each other.
That's right.
Women are the ones who have to wind up saving this stuff. You did something about women's labor in relation to food. You want to talk on that particular issue or where that's at?
Yeah, no, that actually, of course, ties to this issue of International Women's Day, that food work has traditionally been thought of as women's work, right? And you see that in relationship to war.
Except when they get paid in restaurants.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Well, what's interesting about food work is that it's not...
Chefs.
And chefs. That's right. But the food work that's women's work is the unpaid work. And that's true in terms of domestic labor, it's true in terms of private labor, it's also true in terms of the acquisition of food, which is always considered to be a woman's issue. And so what you have is you have this massive field of labor that is not recognized as wage labor, and that is always gendered in terms of women. And so you see this in Syria, but you see this throughout history, that during and after a war, one of the kind of clearest markers of war is that women's work of acquiring food becomes the primal labor. And that's often seen as being a sign of a flawed economy or a catastrophic economy. Although, of course, what's crucial is that labor continues to be crucial even when the war and the crisis is over. So I think one of the very deceptive things about how we think about hunger and famine and violence is that we look at these moments of crisis and we see that women are starving and women are desperate to get food, but women are always starving and always desperate to get food. And that's, in fact, sort of one of the deceptive things about the global food economy, I think, is that it hides that labor except for these moments of crisis.
Very good. It hides it. Yeah. So when in your experience, how long have you been teaching?
4 years. I've been at Loyola. This is my first year at Loyola, though.
What do you find that the young people bring you're not that much older than a young person yourself as I look at you, but what do you find young people bring you in terms of questions regarding this very specific area of study?
I think one of the things that that students are really interested in trying to figure out is how their own food habits, their own food consumption, let's say, is or is not political. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, today for people to think of food and politics in relationship to private consumption. That is to say, if you want to be a political food eater, think about what you eat and how you eat it. And one of the things that I'm really interested in doing with my students is trying to push them further and to have them not only think about what kind of food they buy, but think about what kind of a political sphere this is where acts of buying are seen as the primary mode of political action. Right? Because that itself is a huge part of the modern food economy, right? That it becomes about shopping. And so that's one of the things that I'm really trying to do is push my students away from kind of thinking about shopping as the main sphere of their own engagement with the food economy, right? And push them.
So we just this week had the good news that Dominic's, which had left us last month, is now going to be replaced by Jewel, another pretty mega outfit. But at the same time, we've got the Peterson Gardens starting a huge garden plot that all of you can join in on if you want to. It costs a little money to get one of those planters, but it's about planting food. It's not about planting flowers. Yeah. And it's a lot of food that will be able to be grown in those boxes. What about the movement of gardening, food gardening, and victory gardens coming back into mode because of the food deserts and also the rising costs of food?
And new consciousness about the quality of the food and people participating.
I mean, there's so much I could say. I think it's, first of all, obviously, it's
You're
really
coming
great.
back on the show.
Yeah, we'll have you again.
But I guess maybe in particular in relationship to what I was just saying, I talk to my students about this a lot because they'll look at poor people in the U.S. and internationally, and they'll look at situations of famine, and it's very hard not to judge people for not being able to get adequate food. And I find that it's very hard for my students, even though they want to be sympathetic to these people, it's hard for them to be like, well, why can't they just get their act together and buy better food? Why are they so foolish as to, eat this unhealthy food? This happens in situations of famine often, that people don't know how to prepare the food that's donated to them. And what I remind them of is that, in fact, almost everybody in the U.S., our relationship to food is exclusively around money. And I say to them, if you didn't have money, how long would you survive? I mean, honestly, young people nowadays don't even know how to pick fruit from a tree. I mean, and it's not about, they're so far away from the labor actually connected to food. So I think in that sense, any process by which you think about food that's not directly connected to cash is like a massive sort of global significance, especially for a wealthy country like the U.S., Yeah. So that's, I think, a really important.
Alice Weinreb, one of the things that we've all been watching in the news, a lot of us, is the cut in the food stamps and with the new agricultural bill. And can you tell us a little bit about, there's sort of a resurgence of awareness of poverty in the United States, but tell us the impact of that cut to people's food stamps on women and children and some of the men too.
Yeah, no, it's, well, the history of food welfare in the U.S. is incredibly interesting and incredibly disturbing. Food stamps there's been waves of policy that shape food stamps, and the major cuts that just got passed are essentially cuts to a huge wave of food stamp bills that were passed in the early 70s, and that was in response to the war on poverty, and especially to, in the late 60s, sort of discovery of hunger in America. And there was this series of documentary movies and TV reportages.
Michael Harrington, The Other America.
Exactly, Other America, exactly. And so there's this whole realization, quote unquote, that there was hunger in America. Initially, it was very interested in white hunger in Appalachia, and then there became increasingly sort of exposés on Navajo reservations and Latino communities and African American communities. And then there was a series of bills that were passed. The food aid policy, domestic food aid policy in the U.S. has always been highly problematic and extremely tied to commodity programs and tied to economic prosperity.
And tied to politics.
And tied to politics, of course, exactly.
Right.
So, but it was always targeting women and children, which itself is very interesting because obviously men go hungry too. And there's something also, and you see that even today when we talk about poverty, there's an assumption that men...
Take a breath.
that men are sort of not worthy of, they're not actually hungry, right? And then women and children are the ones that are important and we need to preserve. Exactly. And so I think that in the very fact that food aid is so focused on women and children exposes a real, I think, lack of humanity in how welfare is imagined, that it's really not about the poor or the hungry, but it's about this really sort of population economic calculation, right? So
Good point.
that's like a sort of my negative take. On the other hand, I think it's unbelievable that we're cutting. I have students say this to me. They say, you know, people are abusing the food stamp program. So I think it's. Of course, it's good, but I could see why they're cutting it. And it's just amazing to me that the idea of abusing a food aid program even exists, because how abusing a program that gives food is like...
Yeah,
I mean,
compared to corporations paying no taxes.
Yeah, and it's not abuse. I mean, you're eating. I mean, I don't understand like what you're eating more than you deserve to eat. I mean, it's like such a weird...
It's incredible.
Seafood.
It's incredible.
Seafood.
Yeah, exactly.
There was a thing about people buying seafood
They should
on
buy
Fox.
certain foods. Exactly.
Yeah, there
And
was
that's-
you're supposed to eat terrible food. It's food that's bad for you.
It's a pretty grotesque sort of ethical framework.
Grotesque is a good
Yeah.
word to describe the entire conversation about.
Where did you develop your interest in food?
Well, you know, I grew up in Berkeley, and when I...
In California?
In California, yeah.
Oh, my alma
And-
mater. Well, I went
Oh,
to
yeah.
school there for a while.
No,
Yeah.
no. So I grew up there in the 70s and 80s, and there was a lot of sort of there's a lot of food going on, and people talked about food a lot, and there was a real sense of sort of food and diversity being tied together, like even schools and stuff, and it made, and I remember sort of really growing up with one particular value, which is the one thing you can never do is judge anybody else's eating. Like that was sort of like the sacrosanct cultural icon that everybody eats differently and everybody is different, and that was, and
See, just that was so different from 20 years before.
Oh.
Those of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s rather than the 70s and 80s, we had no concept.
And that's what my parents
of-
said to me. Their whole stories were they were raised both on the East Coast. They were hippies. They got in a car and drove to California. And they said they got to California and they said we're not. And under all their stories they raised me on were the first time I ate an avocado, the first time I ate fruit, the first time I got a free loaf baguette handed out by the and these kind of stories. So it was very sort of about my own personal life there and my parents' life in California that made me.
And are you a good cook?
I am. I do. I enjoy cooking.
And what's your favorite food? Do you like corned beef hash?
Oh, I've never had corned beef. I'm a Californian.
You might as well ask her if she likes something on a shingle. You know, I mean, really.
No, corned beef hash is better than that, Katie.
Better than shingle.
Split beef on toast.
Do you have any words of wisdom for the listening audience about women and food or anything that comes to mind?
I mean, I guess I would just really encourage us all to think about food and labor more actively. I think there's been a real move in the U.S. in particular to sort of cast cooking and eating as acts of pleasure rather than acts of labor. And I think that's a really problematic move because it also then places the onus upon people who are struggling to do the work of food to actually do that properly. So it's become sort of this emotive, like be a good person, be a nice person, be a loving person. And that's really not what food work is about. So,
Alice, we've got to do you justice by having you back because we've run out of time. And so let's thank Alice.
Well, you talk fast.
I
You
talk
got
fast,
a
I got a
lot
lot
in.
in.
You did pack a lot in. God love you.
And before I forget, I want to say happy birthday to Nancy Bacchus, who's in the audience.
Nancy
Let's have a big round of
Bacchus.
applause for Nancy.
Happy birthday.
And tomorrow afternoon at the Heartland is a closing for my photo show, so
Please
I hope a lot of
come.
you show up. 3 to 6, we'll have a good time.
We will. Thank you, Michael James. Let's go out and do good in the world. The world needs all the good that you do. All power to the people.
Right on, sister. Thanks a lot.
oh yeah, it's a pleasure.
We'll talk more. So you went
You're listening to 88.7 WLUW, Chicago Sound Alliance, broadcasting from the campus of Loyola University.
Oh yeah.